Well, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Julie. We've just met, but we're so glad she's here. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about herself, but also about why she's here. Welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. My best friend from childhood is actually also a Baptist, and I remember going to church many more times than I ever went to synagogue with her. So this really does feel like home in a lot of ways. Before I get started, I just wanted to say that I really try to make these conversations as interactive as possible. I don't like to be standing up here just talking at you. I want to have a dialogue. So I'm going to start with a question, and when you speak, I am going to repeat it since we have some folks joining us on Zoom. But please, please, please feel free to interact. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please raise your hand, and I'm more than happy to engage. So with that being said, I wanted to ask for volunteers to share about the first time they remember having an interaction with someone who was different from them, in whatever way you interpret that, and what surprised you about that interaction in a positive way.
Going into college from a Baptist background, thank you. I had a really good friend as a freshman from Selma, Alabama, who was Jewish, and we were very good friends, but finding out in September with all the things, the holidays and the special days that came up right after we started college, it was an eye-opener for me, but we have, remained friends, and it was a good experience.
So what I'm hearing is that you were able to learn something new,
yes,
and that was an enriching experience for
right.
you.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Anyone else? Sure.
My senior year in college, my roommate was Jewish.
Will you say it into the microphone one more time?
My senior year in college, my roommate was Jewish.
And what surprised you about being able to get to know him in such a deep way, being his roommate?
Well, he believed that he was a chosen person.
Ah, okay.
Chosen race.
And when you all had conversations, did you find yourself excited by being able to learn more about why he thought that way?
Well, growing up in the church and everything, I knew he was special race.
So the takeaway I'm going to kind of share, at least from my perspective, by what you just shared, is that you knew that he grew up in a different environment, and even though you had a different experience, you all were able to coexist in a really special way.
We had a lot in common.
Yeah.
A whole lot in common. We were in there struggling. We was always looking for girls.
Well, I hope that you were able to be great supports for each other. Anyone else want to share about the first time they had an experience with someone, whether they were Jewish or not Jewish or whatever, where they were surprised about what they learned? Yeah.
I guess I was probably in my early 30s. I was working at a law firm, and on our little end of the hall, we had me, who was Baptist. One of the attorneys that I worked for was the son of a United Methodist minister. Another one on the hall was Greek Orthodox. Another one was Episcopalian. The other attorney that I worked for was Jewish. She was female. And then the other legal secretary who supported the Greek Orthodox and the Episcopalian was this wild, crazy mixture of Christian and voodoo because she had grown up in Liberia. So there was this, and I say voodoo kind of, not really, but there was this whole different version of Christianity based on her African background and the culture that she had grown up in. And all of us used to have the most interesting religious discussions. And my takeaway from all of that was that all of us were very respectful of each other, and it was an environment where it really allowed us to learn about each other's traditions and backgrounds and beliefs in a very non-threatening environment, just because we worked together, we knew each other, we respected each other, and because we approached it that way, it was a very non-threatening situation.
I love that.
I
That's
loved
beautiful.
it too.
I can imagine. And actually, I want to take a really significant takeaway from what you just shared, which is that you all were working together. So you came from entirely different backgrounds, but you had a common goal that you were working toward. And that was also a unifying factor. That was the unifying factor that allowed you to be able to share about your different faith experiences. And that's actually a point I'm going to make tonight, is that all of us come from very different backgrounds, and there are problems that we still need to address together as a society. And us coming from different backgrounds actually is a strength to allow us to do that. So we'll be focusing on anti-Semitism specifically, about talking or addressing what it is, why it is more prevalent in today's society, and also why folks who are not Jewish and who come from different backgrounds can help us combat it and help us fight it. So I have one more question, which is, how has your faith as Christians impacted how you navigate interactions with people who are different from you?
I think that if we really follow what we're said, that we love our neighbor as ourselves, I think that we have that example for us. Now, do we always do it? No. But I also think the key is to get to know the person, just like when he was saying that, they had something in common. If you get through that first level, I mean, you just have to find that common denominator that you've got somewhere that you can build on. And then also just have respect. I mean, have respect for people and their opinions, and we have to do that about things that aren't this important. We have to just try and respect it, even though if you're thinking, boy, you are crazy for that attitude, but anyhow, but you have to have respect for who they are and what they are saying.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to share how your faith as a Christian has impacted how you interact with others? No? Okay. And I ask that question because I think as people of faith, we have a really strong understanding that this space that we're in, this society, this world is given to us by God, and we should be working to love each other as human beings, no matter who we are or what background we come from, because that's what God wants for us. So with that being said, I'm going to start the presentation, and before I do, I'll introduce myself and share a little bit about who I am, why I'm here. My name is Julie. I think I can claim that I am an Atlanta native because I'm from Marietta. I think Metro Atlanta counts? Okay, good. And I actually have a claim to fame that I am a third-generation Southern Jew. So I'm third-generation Atlanta on my mom's side, and my dad's side is from Louisville, Kentucky. And that's a claim to fame because I have met Jewish people who live in New York who say, wait, there are Jews down south? I say, of course. And we say, y'all, and we're part of this. And I think being a Southern Jew has really shaped who I am because I grew up in an area that had a fair amount of Jews, but that, of course, was majority not Jewish. And I interacted with a lot of folks who were different than me and still had really strong relationships and friendships. And when I graduated from college, I moved to Israel for a bit. I tried to move there permanently, and my mom freaked out and said, no, come home for at least a year, and if you still want to move back to Israel, you can. I said, fine. And I was looking for a job I could do for a year, and a fellowship opened up with the organization I still work for called American Jewish Committee. And it was a year-long fellowship working with young professionals to build relationships with people from different backgrounds. So to do intergroup relations between Christians and Muslims and people from the Black, Latino, Asian, Indian communities, to build these relationships. And I said, wow, well, I grew up in the South as a minority, having really strong relationships with a lot of people who were different from me. This feels like a very natural fit. And so I took this fellowship, and the long story short is 7.5 years later, I am still here. I did not move to Israel, which makes my family very happy. And I'm still here because I care so deeply about this work. And there's a lot of different opinions on whether work should be your life or your passion, but I can truly say that this is my calling, to be able to be here and really just make meaningful relationships with people. And even when the conversations are tough or we don't agree, it's okay because we have that common understanding that we are here building a better world for each other. So that's a little bit about me. American Jewish Committee is the global Jewish advocacy organization for the Jewish people. And we advocate for the well-being of the Jewish people by educating about anti-Semitism, by helping people understand what's going on in Israel, what is Israel, all the complicatedness that often comes with that, but the beauty too, because Israel is a really incredible place. And a big part of our mission is also promoting pluralism and democratic values. And on the surface, that can just kind of seem like words, because what does pluralism mean, and what does democratic values really mean? But to us, that's actually a critically important part of our mission, because Jews have really only thrived in societies that have democratic values, and where people from all different backgrounds could have a voice and feel comfortable and free from discrimination and oppression. And we know that as Jews, we have to make sure that all people have the same rights as us, and all people can feel safe and comfortable in the societies in which we live. So part of what we do, besides our legislative engagement with elected officials, is intergroup relations. That's a huge part of our mission. I mentioned a little bit earlier that the fellowship I did was building relationships with people from different religions, and that continues. That's a huge theme in our work today. And the last thing I'll say is we have a pretty vast infrastructure. We have 25 offices here in the United States. We have, I think we're up to 13 or 14 offices around the world, and 25 partnerships with Jewish communities. So if there's an issue happening in their community, we step in and help to advocate on their behalf. Any questions so far? No? Okay, great. So we'll get started. Understanding anti-Semitism. You'll see headlines that share about some of the things that have happened really just in the past couple of years. Jewish Americans are terrified amid rising anti-Semitic attacks, that anti-Semitism is unfortunately very rampant on social media, and American Jews are just increasingly feeling less and less safe. So why is this happening? How is this happening? A lot of people think that the Holocaust was kind of the pinnacle of anti-Semitism, and it was a absolutely horrible, horrible experience in time. But it unfortunately did not end there. So we're going to explore how anti-Semitism continues to manifest today. So we'll get into what is anti-Semitism, how may it manifest in religious settings, and how it impacts all of us and what we can all do to help keep the Jewish community safe. Okay, so we see headlines. And often when we read something in the newspaper, we say, oh, that's too bad, that's a shame. But I wanted to share some visuals to give a picture of how this happens in our community. This group is called the Goyam Defense League. Goyam actually, ironically, is a Yiddish word that means someone who is not Jewish. And this group is essentially a white supremacist. They are a white supremacist group who believes that Jews are responsible for all of the ills of our society. And they often have demonstrations like this. They hand out flyers on people's lawns in different parts of the city to share all the evils that the Jewish people are doing. They're actually nationwide, but the Goyam Defense League has distributed flyers. It seems like it's been every month or every couple of months for the past few years. I mean, this happens all the time. Who remembers what happened this past summer in East Cobb with the neo-Nazis at a synagogue? Did anyone hear about that? Raise your hand. Okay, so for the folks in the room who weren't aware, this group showed up at a synagogue, actually the one that I grew up at, and held signs out front that said, Jews are, kill the Jews, Jews are the devil, all of the kind of terrible things that you never thought that you would see happening in the US today. And that was really jarring because while these groups have always operated in the underground, they are feeling more and more comfortable coming out in public. This is an example from Brookhaven. You can see it says Jews killed blacks. And this occurred right after all of the issues with Kanye West and his anti-Semitism. Raise your hand if you were familiar with what was happening there. Okay, so Kanye West, for those who may not be unfamiliar, is a very famous musician who said very blatantly anti-Semitic things. Oh, Jews, I don't even remember the specifics of what he said, but he was very vocal about how much he hated Jews and how much he thought they were the ill will of our society. You might be noticing a theme here when I keep talking about Jews causing the ills in our society, and we'll get into it. So after the Kanye West anti-Semitism issues, we actually received across the country a significant rise in bomb threats against Jewish institutions. And the lesson from that is that when people have influence and they spread hate, it matters and it has an impact. This, I believe, is also from Brookhaven, Stop Kikes, which is an anti-Semitic slur. Okay, so statistics. How are American Jews feeling about this? 41% of, this is actually Americans in general, not just American Jews, have witnessed an anti-Semitic incident in person, online, or against a Jewish institution over the past 12 months. This statistic is from our State of Anti-Semitism survey, which we do every year. And we survey the Jewish American population about their perceptions of anti-Semitism and their feelings on it. And we also survey the general public. So knowing that this is 41% of the general public who's seen anti-Semitism, I think it speaks volumes to the understanding that, wow, this is an issue. This is huge. Nearly 4 in 10 American Jews say they have avoided at least one of 3 behaviors for fear of anti-Semitism: avoided certain places, avoided making themselves visually identifiable as a Jew, and refrained from posting Jewish-related content online. And I'll tell you that when I go to synagogue, I always sit facing the door because I want to be able to see who's coming in and out. And when I was at synagogue last week for the high holidays, someone came to the door who, I think he was probably harmless, right? But he was someone who I needed to say something about, because we always have this fear in the back of our minds about anti-Semitism. Anytime you visit a synagogue, you will never just be able to walk in. There's always going to be typically armed security outside with the door locked, because the threats, they're very high now, and Jewish institutions have often had to double the amount of security and the amount they're paying for security in the past 5 years. I know a lot of religious institutions are starting to have security too, not just synagogues, but mosques and churches. The Jewish community, unfortunately, has always had to have their doors locked and not have open doors, because we've always had this issue. Okay. And before we understand anti-Semitism, we have to ask, who are Jewish people? So my question for you all is, how many Jews are in the world? A lot, okay. A number? 7 million, okay. Anyone else?
45 million.
45 million?
1.8% of the American population.
Okay, a very specific statistic, okay. Anyone else want to throw out a number for how many Jews are in the entire world? Okay, so you were correct that they're about 2% of the American population, and there are almost 15 million of us in the world. Is that less than a lot of people thought?
Yeah, that's less.
Yeah. How many did you think?
I was thinking more like 45 million.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the population of Israel is. And I knew there was a population of the United States. And that's most, I think that is most Jewish people.
Yeah, you're right. So there's about a little over 6 million Jews in Israel, and about 6 million here in the States. And then the remaining however million there are spread around the world. Yeah, so we're very small. And we still have not reached pre-Holocaust numbers. But, sure.
When I first learned that number, what struck me was the disproportionate impact of So when I first learned the low number, it struck me how disproportionate the impact. How many U.S. Supreme Court justices are Jewish? How many heads of companies? The influence in the entertainment industry and all in the United States, the impact of the Jewish population to be less than 2% is remarkably out of proportion, it seems.
Yeah, so I can definitely touch on some reasons that might be. The first is that Jews were not allowed to be in regular society really until, I would say, starting the 60s, 70s. So to share an anecdote, my mom grew up in Atlanta, and she lived in an all-Jewish neighborhood, not because they all wanted to live together, but because in the other neighborhoods, in the deeds of the home, it was written that they could not be sold to Jewish people or black people. And my mom was born in 55, if I'm allowed to share her age. So she grew up in the 60s and 70s. And she remembers when the first Jewish family moved out of a Jewish neighborhood into one of these non-Jewish neighborhoods, I think either late 60s or early 70s, and they were harassed and their windows smashed. And I mean, that's well within, the fact this is my mom who's 68 years old. So Jews really were only considered part of general American society starting around 70s, I would say. And they had to create their own successes before that. Actually, there's a good amount of Jews who are litigators, attorneys who are litigators, And the reason for that is because back in the day, it was considered kind of low class to be a lawyer who was actually a litigator in the courtroom. And so Jews ended up taking those spots because no one else wanted to do it. And in the entertainment industry, Jews were not allowed to work for production companies, and so they started their own. And now that we have been able to assimilate into regular society, it shows up as success, kind of general success, but it's important to understand why that happened, because they really had to build their own successes and stick together. Does that answer your question? Part of it. There's a lot more, but for sake of time, yeah. So we are multinational, multiracial, multi-ethnic, and the part that a lot of people don't understand is that Judaism is not just a religion, it's a peoplehood and a culture. So you might hear a Jewish person say, well, I'm Jewish, but I'm atheist. And that's because, again, we're a peoplehood and a culture. Jews are very diverse. More than 50% of the population of Israel are Jews of color, and they originate from Middle Eastern and North African lands. So actually, my stepmom and my stepbrother are Moroccan Israeli, and they're dark. Like they don't look like me, and a lot of Jews in Israel look the same way. 20% of Jews in the US also are Jews of color. And it's not just Middle Eastern, but there are Black Jews, Asian Jews, Latino Jews. So a lot of times we'll hear a comment, oh, you don't look Jewish. But even though sometimes there might be what people perceive as a stereotypical Jewish look, it's absolutely not accurate. There's Jews from all over who look very differently. And this just explains the population. Again, lots of diversity within our community. You'll see some people praying they are likely Ethiopian Jews, and there's a whole fascinating story about Ethiopian Jews and their journey coming to Israel. That is for a later time, but I'm happy to share a podcast with y'all if you're interested. Okay, so we covered who were the Jews. So if we were playing Jeopardy, you guys would be able to share some answers, right? Okay. So we'll get into what is anti-Semitism. Before I get started, I'm just going to touch on the fact that this might seem like a silly question, right? Because we all might think we know what anti-Semitism is. But that's actually one of the reasons we do so much education around it, is because anti-Semitism is not straightforward. Sometimes it might be. Sometimes we might see a swastika and say, okay, that's anti-Semitism. But the ways that anti-Semitism manifests are often really coded. And so we have to help people understand how to recognize it before we can combat it. Now, this definition is from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition. And this is kind of like the gold standard definition of anti-Semitism. It's been adopted by hundreds of countries, by 1,100 plus institutions around the world. And it was created by a group of experts who got together for years, crafting a definition that would enable the decision makers and leaders to understand what it is. So it's that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Does anyone know why it says certain perception instead of negative perception? Okay, so it's because sometimes anti-Semitism can manifest positively, or in a perceived positive way. So if someone says, oh, Jews, you guys are all so rich and you control everything. On the surface, some people might think that's a compliment, but the problem is that when you say that someone controls everything or has so much influence, that oftentimes, and I'm not talking about, impact, which is what you were asking earlier. I'm talking about when someone says, oh, Jews control everything. It means that they can very easily become the scapegoat. And that is what's happened for the past 2,000 years. So obviously in Nazi Germany, Jews were the scapegoat. during periods like the Inquisition, during the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, which is actually how my family got to the States because we were trying to escape the pogroms in the early 1900s. This has always been a general theme, that Jews are controlling everything, and because things are not going right, then they are the people to blame, and therefore we must eliminate them. So this idea of Jewish control is a conspiracy theory. And this is actually something that we really need to educate on when it comes to anti-Semitism, because, on the surface, if you hear kind of a general conspiracy theory, you don't necessarily know that most of them come back to this idea of Jewish control. So you'll see here that Jews did 9/11 on this rock. Jews will not replace us from the 2017 rallies in Charlottesville, Virginia. And what all this has in common is that the Jews are the problem. They are causing all the problems. They are the puppeteers. You'll often see anti-Semitic imagery that depicts Jews as being the puppets of the world. So just kind of be aware that when you hear a conspiracy theory, something like QAnon, for instance, when we're talking about QAnon, it comes back to this idea that there's a group of people controlling this world, and that's inevitably going to come back to the Jews. So anti-Semitism rises when there's elections, because there's a lot of tension in our society when there's something like an election that causes divisiveness. During Jewish holidays, because that's probably the most well-known time of year that anti-Semites know that Jews are going to synagogue, and violence in the Middle East. So you'll see actually in this picture, it was from May 2021. It was after the conflict, or during the conflict between Israel and the terrorist group Hamas in Gaza. And violent anti-Semitic incidents rose 80% here in the States. And this is important because often we'll hear, well, you want to talk about Israel and how it relates to anti-Semitism, but that's a political issue. We don't need to talk about Israel. Let's just focus on anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, it is often very, very connected. And while we don't conflate legitimate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, we must understand that when things happen in Israel and the way that people talk about Israel and talk about the Jewish connection to Israel, that has a direct impact on anti-Semitism. Reverend, will you tell me how much time I have left? 13? Okay, great. This just shows violent anti-Semitic incidents in the US and around the world from the past, I guess, a little over 10 years. Okay, so great. We know what anti-Semitism is. We know that it's happening. How do we recognize it? There's 4 categories that we share: hatred toward Jews, conspiracies, scapegoating, and Holocaust denial, and inappropriately invoking Israel. And I actually meant to mention this at the beginning, but we at AJC are a staunchly nonpartisan organization. On the surface, that is because we're a 501c3 that is unable to support parties or candidates. But being a nonpartisan organization is actually critically important to our work, because anti-Semitism manifests from all over the political spectrum, and if we are just calling anti-Semitism out on one side of the spectrum or the other, then we're not doing our job. And the reason I say this is because, along with these categories, anti-Semitism can manifest from the right, the left, and religious extremism. And religious extremism typically manifests in different ways around the world. But it's important to know that anti-Semitism can come from someone making a comment about how Jews, the neo-Nazis in 2017, Jews will not replace us. And it can come from the left when they're using Israel as a way to justify their anti-Semitic views or alienating Jewish people or Jewish students on campus. That's a huge issue for us, is Jewish kids on campus are often kicked out of organizations if they don't disavow their connection to Israel. And the way that I try to share about this is that if you said to a Chinese American person, we hate what the Chinese government is doing in Tibet, and you have to disavow your relationship with China to be included in our club, then it would be pretty obvious that that's blatant racism, right? But unfortunately, this happens all the time to Jewish students, and for some reason, it's a bit harder for people to make that connection. Okay, so hatred towards Jews. I'm going to share a few examples from our Translate Hate Guide, which we have copies over there on the table. When you're leaving, feel free to take one. It shares about all the anti-Semitic kind of tropes and images to help you better recognize them. And this is the idea that Jews are the devil, and has led to issues like the Inquisition and persecution for Jews. So you'll see here that being depicted as the devil obviously doesn't do good things for people bringing you in, accepting you into the society that you're in. And then deicide is the idea that Jews collectively as a people are responsible for the death of Jesus. And that has also led to things like the Inquisition and led to a lot of problems for Jewish people. And I know this can, especially in a church setting, this can be complicated. And so I encourage you to lean on your leadership to ask more questions and dive into this deeper at a different time. Or, Reverend, if you want to share anything about it now, you're welcome to. I'm going to grab the microphone.
Yeah, I'm just going to hand the mic to Doc. No, I think it is, several of the texts that we've had the last couple of weeks through the lectionary have been used. I'm trying to remember the exact text for this week. But it's this, when we think of the Pharisees, right, they are the problem. And we name the Pharisees as the problem a lot of times in that story of Jesus. And that is, it's an unfair characterization of an entire race of people when it was a specific set of leaders. If I make a mistake or Doc makes a mistake as a pastor, you don't say every Baptist pastor ever, it can be problematic. Anything you want to add?
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we kind of touched on this briefly, but conspiracies, greed. I mean, I think that probably most people have heard an anti-Semitic trope that Jews are greedy or stingy, and that leads to a lot of problems. You'll see on the far right that Zionists control Wall Street. Oftentimes people will use the term Zionist to try to mask the fact that they're talking about Jews. But 90% of American Jews identify as Zionists. Zionists are people, you don't have to be Jewish to be Zionist, but a Zionist is someone who believes in the Jewish right to self-determination and their native homeland of Israel. And you can be a Zionist with all different political beliefs, both domestically here in the States, both or in Israel, opinions about what's going on in Israel. I have a lot of, very liberal friends who are Zionist. I have a lot of very conservative friends who are Zionists. So it's just this idea that there should be a Jewish state in Israel. So basically, when people use the term Zionist to try to mask that, they're trying to refer to, just some of these people who control things and have so much greed and wealth. Unfortunately, it is just a dog whistle for anti-Semitism, or for Jews. So that's greed, control, we've talked about quite a bit. And not the real Jews. This one has actually come up a lot recently. and I live near the Beltline, and there's a group of people who claim that they are the real Jews. And oftentimes this will come from groups like the Hebrew Israelites. And I want to be very clear that there are many Jews who are black or, come from different races. It's not a race thing. It's about a group of people pointing to someone like me, someone who is very Jewish, comes from a long line of Jewish people, and says, no, you guys are just the imposters, and we are the real chosen people. So these people on the Beltline are preaching that every day in front of very crowded areas, and that's happening literally right here, right down the street, pretty much, in Atlanta. Holocaust denial distortion. A lot of that feels very obvious, right? If you deny the Holocaust, that's problematic. But recently we've seen a big uptick in people distorting the Holocaust or using the Holocaust to make inappropriate comparisons here in the States. You'll see Zionist criminals in the Palestine Holocaust making a claim that Israel is committing a Holocaust against the Palestinians is just blatantly inaccurate. And the reason that kind of spills over into anti-Semitism is because it's not a legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. You can be very critical of the Israeli government's policies in the West Bank or with the Palestinians, but to say that there's a Holocaust going on is just blatantly false, and it's demonizing. And demonizing Jews has been an anti-Semitic theme for centuries. So something that I really want to underscore is that these tropes that we're going through have existed for thousands of years. And in every generation, they manifest differently. So saying, let's say, blood libel, which is this idea that, back in the Middle Ages, it was that Jewish people killed Christian children to bake their blood in matzah, which is the traditional bread, or traditional cracker that we eat on Passover, one of our holidays. First of all, that's against the laws of kosher, so we wouldn't do it anyway. But second of all, it's a way to demonize Jews. And looking at what's going on today, when you say that, or when people say that the Jews or the Israelis are killing Palestinian babies for the fun of it, right? That's another form of blood libel that's manifesting in that way in 2023. Did you have a question? No? Okay. So that's kind of the general theme I want you guys to take away, is that these tropes have been the same for 2,000 years, right? And we just have to figure out how to recognize them in 2023. And inappropriately invoking Israel, we kind of talked about, again, using the term Zionist or Zio to demonize the Jewish people under the guise of it being politically correct. You'll see Kanye, one of his tropes was that Jewish Zionists control the media and own the black vote, et cetera, et cetera. Again, an example of the surge of anti-Semitism in 2021 during the conflict between Israel and Hamas. So, why are we here? Why are we learning about this? In the Jewish faith, the most important thing is action. And I can imagine as Christians, it's a huge part of your faith too, is if you see suffering or you see injustice, that you take action, you help your neighbor. And so can a billboard end anti-Semitism? No, but you're not a billboard. So let's finish up by sharing what can we do to make sure that we're spreading awareness about what anti-Semitism is and we're taking steps to combat it. Recognize, respond, and prevent. So I mentioned the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It's incredibly helpful. You can go home and Google IRA definition, and it shows you both the definition and many examples that help you recognize how anti-Semitism is manifesting today. Translate Hate, the resource I mentioned, is sitting on the table, helps us identify different tropes. And knowing who Jews are. So something that I really try to harp on is that, yes, we have to combat this really insidious form of hate But at the same time, we should all get to know each other, right? Because we have found in our studies that if someone knows a Jewish person or knows multiple Jewish people, they are significantly less likely to hold anti-Semitic views. So that's my charge is let's get together. We at AJC have many events that we do to bring together the non-Jewish community with the Jewish community. Our most notable one being our Unity Seder. That will take place on April 8th, save the date. And that's a really special experience because we share about the story of Passover, a very central part of our faith. And we have table conversations where people share what their Exodus story is and how they relate to this story. And it is so beautiful and so unifying. So we would really love to see y'all there. Responding and raising awareness, speaking out. If someone shares a conspiracy theory that seems like it probably has anti-Semitic roots, say something to them, right? It sounds simple, but oftentimes it's hard because we don't want to rock the boat. And my mantra all day, every day is it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So oftentimes I do trainings on how to advocate and how to have conversations, especially difficult conversations. And I'm sure your leadership also has that with you. So, my advice is always if someone says something anti-Semitic, there's a 95% chance it's just ignorance. It's not meant with malice. But unfortunately, the repercussions that come from that are insidious. So we have to say something, but let's do it by bringing people in and sharing what we know, and maybe even inviting them to dinner or a gathering with a Jewish person or Jewish friends so that we can dispel those stereotypes. And preventing it. Educate, be an ally, and note the positive. So again, bring people together with the Jewish community. We are always happy to be a resource at AJC, and we will share events with your leadership if you're interested in joining us. But there's so much beauty in the Jewish faith and the Jewish culture and the Jewish people, and we, of course, need to educate about anti-Semitism, but it's also important to remember that we are so proud and blessed with our heritage, and we hope that y'all will join us in helping people understand that too. And that's it. And on that note, I wanted to ask if anyone has any final questions. Yeah.
The Bible clearly tells that God said that I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you.
And, I think that's a really, obviously a good thing to point to Scripture and say, this is what's there, right? I think it can also apply to just generally blessing all people, right? So yes, the Jews are the chosen people not because we are special or better than anyone. That's oftentimes a common misconception, is that Jews think they're better than everyone else because they're the chosen people. It's absolutely not true. The theology behind that is actually that God went to all these different nations and said, do you want to be my people? Do you want to be my people? And the Jews, and he said, this is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy to be my people. You have to, do all these extra things that other groups won't have to do. And the Jews happened to be the group that took on that responsibility. So putting that out there because I want to make sure it's understood that it's not meant to be a superiority thing. It's meant to be we are very much charged with making this world a better place.
Now, when you were growing up, you had to learn Hebrew?
Yeah, so the question was, when I was growing up, did I have to learn Hebrew? Yes, I had to go to Hebrew school. And if you ask most Jewish kids if they enjoy Hebrew school, they will tell you no. But yes, that is the language that we learn in, or that we learn to be able to study Torah.
What I was wondering is if you have statistics about the German people, have they increased their anti-Semitism since the Holocaust, or where do they remain now?
They have they've actually done a very good job with educating about the Holocaust and educating about anti-Semitism, but unfortunately we are seeing a very sharp rise in anti-Semitism across Europe. So that includes Germany. They're not the worst country with it right now, but it is a problem.
After the war, we could not find a Nazi. Wouldn't admit he was a Nazi.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if the people today admit they are Jews.
The people who live in Germany, the Jewish people in Germany admit that they're Jews? Is that the question? Oh my gosh. Probably some of them don't. There is a Jewish community in Germany, and I do know German Jews, but it is, I think a lot of Jews who live in Europe, actually especially in Europe right now, anti-Semitism is very bad. And I know a lot of people who will hide their symbols of their kippah, their head covering. And actually, French Jews, anti-Semitism is really bad in France. And they've been moving to Israel in droves because of anti-Semitism. I think about 5,000 Jews a year over the past several years. One more question and then, okay.
I just wonder, if you walk on the street, can we tell you are Jewish?
So it goes back to what I was saying a bit earlier about how people sometimes have an idea of what a Jew looks like, a stereotype of what a Jew looks like, but we are actually very diverse. So maybe someone might think or know that I'm Jewish, but there are Black Jews and Asian Jews and Latino Jews and Middle Eastern Jews, so the answer is not necessarily.
So, therefore, does it make the religion make you Jewish? Or what makes you Jewish?
What makes you Jewish is either being born Jewish or converting into Judaism. And we do not proselytize, so if someone wants to convert, they actually have to ask 3 times to show that they really want to join the Jewish people.
But for you to say you're born Jewish means you were born of someone, but how did they get to be Jewish?
So typically, different denominations of Judaism believe different things about who is a Jew, but the more, the kind of long-standing view is that if you have a Jewish mother, you are Jewish, but some denominations like the Reform movement believe that you can also be Jewish through your father.
I'm still not clear whether it's ethnicity or religion that makes
It's
you Jewish.
both.
It's both.
And that's the complicated part.
Okay, all right.
Right.
And also, I've heard about if men, if they visit, they're not Jewish, but they visit the synagogue, they have to wear yarmulkes.
It depends on the synagogue.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I know the Reverend is here. I'm happy to stick around for questions. Thank you all so much for having me.
If you all have questions for Julie, I'm sure she's willing to answer them offline. But what an enlightening night. So helpful. We're grateful for you as a conversation partner and you guys as conversation partners. And, the truth about Baptists is we can come into a room, 2 of us, and have 3 different opinions. And so we don't have to leave here tonight all believing the same thing except for one. And that is, all I see around this place are children of God. Right? And that's a blessing. And we're blessed with your presence, and thank you for being here. Good night.